I'm going to share my screen, God willing. Without further ado, I give you Professor Eric Gertner with Music and the Holocaust. Take it away, Eric.
Okay, so welcome back, those of you who were able to hear my talk on athletes in the Holocaust last week. Those of you who weren't not, and this is the first opportunity to meet with me on Zoom, welcome, glad that you can join us. Just a few housekeeping matters of my own. I just thought I would mention, if you've been watching the newspaper over the last week or so, you will see the activities undertaken by athletes in the political sphere. So it harkens back to the lack of such activity during the Berlin Games and the boycotting of the Games. Everybody now seems to be on board for protests, even when you're playing the national anthem. So that's very interesting. The other housekeeping matter that I point out is I just went on the computer this morning and saw that Vera Lynn, the British songstress who entertained the British troops during the Second World War, passed away. She's famous for her version of We'll Meet Again, which is, I thought, appropriate for this Zoom meeting. She died at the ripe old age of 103. So quite a life that she led. So today I'm going to talk about music and the Holocaust. And to point out my lack of credentials, I'm going to point out the fact that I am not a musician. I've never studied music. I have never played an instrument, but I'm very interested in music. My family was not terribly musical, except for my father, who could whistle any tune he wanted. It's a habit that my brother and I both inherited, much to people's chagrin sometimes, because we might overdo it. But that's my musical experience. Other than when I was 16 years old, I was the singer in I guess you'd call it a rock band. We had one public performance, and it was so good that we thought we'd never do another one, and so we retired. So today I'm going to talk about music and the Holocaust, and as with last week's talk, the talk will be divided into three parts. The first part, in this case, will deal with the pre-1933 period of Jews and music. Second part will deal with 1933 to 1945, the period of the Third Reich. And the third part will deal with the post-war, post-Holocaust period, really up to today. But what I thought I would start with is a short 5-minute video clip that gives you the history of Jewish music from the 9th century to the present by a group called the Y-Studs. So take it away, Segal.
Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel, Sur Yeshuati, Lechana Elishabeh, Nachamol, Takenachamo, Kometzale, Olo, Avdatik Batenu, Hadatik Bashnot Hayim, Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharei, Malachei Hamba, Nagila Hamba, Nagila Hamba, Nagila Benismechaim, Dear Mr. Shane, let me explain, my dear Mr. Shane, that's great. Yisrael Chai, Oster Shalom B'Roma. ידיים של זהב, ושל נחושת ושל אור, לא שיריי אני כינור. If I were a rich man, Shabbos min Yeshua, Mashiach, Mashiach. It's time for Hanukkah. Oh, Yavo Shalom Aleinu, oh, Yavo Shalom Aleinu, oh, Yavo Shalom Aleinu, De'ah Kula. B'yotzim Tzara. מבינים את העניינים ומבינים את המסיבה, אנשים אחד על השני בתוך הרחבה, אז תרימו את הידיים אל השמיים, בגבות לא גבה, על בלי אותו שבלבם תוציא,
enjoyed our take on the pentatonics evolution of music. This is our attempt to present the evolution of Jewish music through time. Music and culture often reflect the moods and ideas of their time. We feel that each song here in some sense represents something unique in the development of Jewish music and often in Jewish history. So, which song is your favorite? Which would you like to see us release a full-length cover of? Let us know in the comments below. And please like, subscribe, and share. Shana Tova and Happy New Year!
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that walk through Jewish music history. Obviously, you saw it start at the 9th century, but the Jews have been engaged in music from biblical times. There are many references in the Torah to musical instruments. David had his own, the lyre, as his musical instrument. Of course, King Solomon is famous for the Song of Songs. And we recite at every Passover the famous Song of the Sea, which is the celebration by Jews after they crossed the Red Sea and watched the Egyptian soldiers drown in the sea as it closed up on them. So our history goes back thousands of years. I'm going to focus on a period much more close to our present time. I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about the evolution of modern Jewish music, or popular Jewish music, which really starts at the beginning of the 19th century. And just before that, we've had the French Revolution with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, Napoleon then takes over in France and conquers most of Europe, and also liberates many parts of Europe. And it's from that point really that Jews become engaged in popular music. Up until that point, and certainly from about the Middle Ages till that point, Jews were really involved in religious or liturgical music, and not really popular music. And so we have in the early part of the 19th century, two very famous Jewish composers, Giacomo Meyerbeer, and probably the better known Felix Mendelssohn. Although by that point, by the time he has developed his career, he has given up Judaism and been baptized, but he is still recognized, and certainly by the Nazis during the Third Reich, he was recognized as a Jew. The citizens of his hometown of Leipzig built a statue to him in 1848, shortly after his death, which the Nazis tore down when they came to power. But you'll be happy to know that the statue was recreated in more modern times. So that's sort of the beginning of the evolution of popular music. And of course, in Europe, from about the middle of the 19th century up until 1933, Jews were involved in all forms of music. There were Jewish opera singers, there were Jewish cabaret performers, there were composers, there were conductors, there were performances, members of orchestras. Perhaps the two most famous orchestras in the world at the time were the Berlin Philharmonic and the Vienna Philharmonic. And each of them had Jewish members. There were 4 Jews who performed as part of the Berlin Philharmonic, and 13 members who performed as members of the Vienna Philharmonic, including the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic. So the Jews had obviously made a significant inroad into music at that point in time. So all of this comes to a crashing halt, in Europe at least, when the Nazis come to power. And I'll get to that in a moment when we flip the chart to post-1933. But I want to talk a little bit about music in North America, in particular the United States. The flowering of modern music, as we know it, really starts in the United States, starts in the early part of the 20th century with the musicians who wrote music at Tin Pan Alley and in the Brill Building in Manhattan. And we have, of course, famous Jewish composers like Irving Berlin. In the 20s and 30s, we have George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin. And so musicians of the Jewish faith were making their mark in North America in a big way. Not only in popular music, but also in musicals. We had Rodgers and Hart, who were writing musicals for Broadway at the time. And so there was an amazing confluence of events. The Jews became free, they became part of popular music, they took part in popular culture. And that was really an amazing confluence of events, as I said. And a lot of that comes to a crashing halt when the Nazis come to power in January of 1933. And Hitler is appointed the chancellor by von Hindenburg. So let me begin with the 1933 to 1945 period. And here we have a little slide telling us what we're talking about. And here's a sign that was commonly seen in German shops or German restaurants. It says, "Jews are not served here." And that really is a summation of what happened to Jews in general in Germany after Hitler came to power, but it's also what happened to Jewish musicians. So let me just set the stage for what happens to Jews generally. There are a series of laws that are enacted starting in March or so of 1933. The Weimar Constitution, which is a very liberal constitution, much like our own Charter of Rights, is suspended by Hitler. And so all the rights of freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, they're all suspended. And then rights are begun to be taken away by Hitler and the Nazi regime. Jews lose their citizenship as German citizens. Professionals are dismissed from their jobs. Lawyers are no longer able to practice for the most part. Jewish physicians can only treat Jewish patients. And as time goes on, up until the beginning of the war, the rights of Jews are constantly being diminished. And so to give you an example, Jews are not allowed to walk on parts of the sidewalk. Jews are not allowed to spend time in public parks. Jews are not even, as said in the diary by Victor Klemperer, they're not even allowed to own dogs. So if you have a dog, you have to give it up or you have to put it down. So the whole point of this exercise was obviously to take away the rights of the Jews and to take away any dignity that the Jews had. And as part of this process, as leading up to the war, not only were these rights taken away, but basically Jewish businesses were taken over, they were Aryanized, they were sold by their owners for a fraction of their value. It even went so far as Jewish assets, like their furniture, when people left the country, if they were able to, were expropriated or taken by the state. Jewish instruments were seized by the German government, the Nazi regime, including things like Stradivarius violins and Granaro violins. All of these things were taken away. This is part of the effort to, as I said, to push Jews out of the German civilization. And of course, the loss of jobs in the music field also applied to the music field. So those members of the Berlin Philharmonic, and when Austria is taken over by the Nazis in the Vienna Philharmonic, they're all dismissed. A few of them die during the war. Many of them do survive, and they're not terribly welcomed back by either of those orchestras. Jewish performers are not allowed to perform for Aryan audiences. Jewish music teachers can no longer teach. Jewish music, in fact, is banned as degenerate music. And there's a big exhibition that takes place in about 1937 where it's called Degenerate Music, and people flock to see the exhibition. The interesting thing is that the most popular part of the exhibition, where people spent time, was watching or listening to jazz, which of course was not really accepted by Hitler and the Nazi regime. So all of these things start to happen to Jews. At the same time, we see tremendous developments continuing in North America. Benny Goodman, as a jazz clarinet player, has his debut, I think probably the first jazz performer to debut at Carnegie Hall in 1938. R.D. Shaw is a famous jazz musician as well. But also what happens after 1933 is many German, Austrian, Czech musicians in particular are trying to get out of Europe, and especially to escape to the United States if they can, or if not, to go to England, any place that would accept them, of course. So what happens is many of the famous Jewish composers in these countries are able to make it to the United States. They are obviously out of their element, but they are, many of them moved to LA to be part of Hollywood and to make music for movies, which of course after the late 20s become talkies with music that can be played on the screen. So I think it's important to understand the impact that these emigres had on film music in particular. And so what I'm going to do is just run down a number of the Jewish musicians Jewish composers who made a significant impact on Hollywood. And once the Oscars are created, they win many, many Oscars. So just to give you an idea of the period between 1933 and 1960, the emigre composers win quite a number of Oscars for music. So I'm just going to read off some of these names that might be familiar to you. Erich Wolfgang Kornfeld wins an Oscar in 1936 for a movie called Anthony Adverse, and in 1938 for the movie The Adventures of Robin Hood. Miklos Rocha wins an Oscar 3 years, Spellbound in 1945, A Double Life in 1947, and Ben-Hur, which we all probably remember, in 1959. Franz Waxman wins an Oscar in 1956 for Sunset Boulevard. In 1951, sorry, 1950 was the first one. In 1951 for A Place in the Sun. Andre Previn, who is the child of survivors, but also was in Europe during the war, wins the Oscar for Gigi in 1958. Porgy and Bess as the Best Musical Score, 1959. And then Ernest Gold wins the Oscar for Best Musical Score for the movie Exodus, which we all, of course, know. So these are about quite a number of Oscars in the musical field won by, all of these are Jewish emigres from Europe. They are accepted into the music business in Hollywood, probably in part because most of the studios, if not all the studios, were owned by Jews. And so they were able to find their position. Now, obviously, some musicians who did make it to the United States and didn't make it into the movie business, but they did have some successful careers, but these are the stars of that particular era. But just to add to this golden era of Jewish composers for film, I should point out that in many of the years that I didn't mention, Jews also won Oscars for Best Music or Best Musical Score. Just to give you an idea, so they won an Oscar for music in 1938, 1940, 1941, 1943, 1947, 1949, 1952, 1953, 1955, 1956, 1958, and 1959. In the 27 years between 1933 and 1960, there are almost 20 Jewish composers who win an Oscar for Best Music or Best Song or Best Musical Score. One composer who you may not have heard of stands out because he won 9 Academy Awards for musical scores by himself. His name is Alfred Newman. He's not the guy in the Mad magazine. He has an illustrious career. He received 45 nominations for his music for Academy Awards. And his brother, also a musician, wrote scores for about 90 movies. His 2 sons together composed scores for more than 125 movies. And you may have heard of his nephew, Randy Newman, who has won 2 Oscars and has received 22 nominations. So that was certainly an amazing development from Jews who really had nothing to do with popular music to really take over the Academy Awards in the music category. And if you were to look at the period when the Tonys start for Broadway, you would see a similar success for Jewish composers of song and lyrics and musical scores for theater in that same period. And both of them continue today in those categories. The émigrés not only included composers, the émigrés also included 2 young men who were jazz aficionados. They were not musicians themselves, but they were really interested in jazz. And when they come to North America and the United States in particular, they are obviously in love with jazz, and they start a small company called Blue Note Records, which is the premier jazz label for jazz musicians up until this day. And a couple of years ago, there was a great documentary about the 2 individuals, Alfred Lyon and Francis Wolff, who were the founders of the company. And not only did they publish these records, they were very important for supporting jazz musicians who often when they're starting out, especially in the early days, were not making a lot of money. And so they supported the likes of Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell, Art Blakey, Miles Davis, Lee Morgan, Kenny Burrell, John Coltrane, and Herbie Hancock. So that's like the pantheon of jazz up until the modern day. So that's what happens to Jewish musicians who are able to get out. Obviously, the war starts in 1939, on September 1st, 1939. And the musicians who were, for the most part, unable to get out of Europe before then are stuck in Europe with a few exceptions, which I'll mention a little bit later on. But we now move into the war period, the period of the Third Reich from 1933 to 1945. I guess we're not getting the little slide. It tells us that. So what, oh, there we go. We have this period, 1933. Oh, sorry, we missed one. There we go. We have 1933 to 1945, the Third Reich. And the picture you saw was a picture of Benny Goodman's clarinet. So what happens during the war? The same thing that happened to Jews generally happened to musicians. They were herded into ghettos. They were sent to camps. They were sent to labor camps. They were sent to concentration camps and extermination camps. Some of them escaped into the forests. Some of them were able to make it out of Europe, or at least Europe proper, and into Russia, and could spend the war years in Russia, or the Soviet Union, as it was then known. But many of them were trapped. Now, what happened to those who were trapped? Well, you won't be surprised to learn that many of them who ended up in the camps ended up dying in the camps. Some survived. Some played important roles in some of the camps, which I'll mention in a little bit. But just to give you an idea of the number of, or the kinds of musicians who were being sent to the camps. And in particular, one camp attracted many of the top musicians, especially from Czechoslovakia, and that was Theresienstadt. And in Theresienstadt, you have a number of famous intellectuals like H.G. Alder, Leo Beck, Ellen Burka, Viktor Frankl, the philosopher, and Ivan Klima, the writer. But there were also a number of musicians who were able to survive, and some of them have become quite well known. Karl Anserl, who was the conductor for a period of time of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, Alice Hertz-Sommer, who we'll mention a little bit more about later, Zuzana Uzakova, who was the world's famous harpsichordist until she died about a year ago, and Coco Schumann, who was a famous jazz musician in France. But many of them are there in Theresienstadt, and while they're in Theresienstadt, they are still composing music. And so we have a number of composers who I'll mention who, during their time in Theresienstadt, before each of them is sent to Auschwitz and eventually dies there, are busy composing music, and in some cases are conducting performances of music in Theresienstadt itself. So some of these musicians are people like Pavel Haas, who wrote Brundabar, the children's opera, Irene Klein, Hans Krasa, Raphael Schachter, who I'll mention a little bit more about in a few moments, and Victor Ullmann, who was probably the most prolific of the composers in Theresienstadt. It's estimated that he put together about 20 musical scores while he was in Theresienstadt. So this was a hotbed of musical activity. And as I said, there were performances put on by these musicians. They put together choirs to perform for the other people in the camp. And of course, there's the famous visit by the Red Cross to Theresienstadt, the model camp, where they are fooled or hoodwinked by the Nazis and the propaganda. But one of the things they see is they see a performance of something called the Verdi Requiem, conducted by Raphael Schachter, who I mentioned before. And this Requiem is a famous Verdi Requiem, which subsequently becomes known, certainly in Jewish circles, as the Defiant Requiem, because of how it was put together by Raphael Schechter. So this required quite a large choir, and this requiem was put on a number of different occasions over the period of years that the camp existed. The important thing to understand is that the endeavor required the ability to constantly replace members of the choir as they were being transported, mostly to Auschwitz. So this requiem was performed a number of times, always almost with a different cast in the choir. What's fascinating about this requiem is it showed, as was the case with the people who were continuing to compose in Theresienstadt, their defiance in a sense of their Nazi captors. The Verdi Requiem is a story about good and evil. Raphael Schechter decides to put on the Requiem in Latin. I suspect that most of the people in the choir did not learn Latin and certainly didn't understand Latin. And the good thing is that most of the Germans who watched the Requiem didn't understand Latin either. So really, the Requiem, towards the end of the Requiem, is basically a statement about what is to happen to the people who are evil, directed at the Germans who are enjoying this musical treat conducted by Raphael Schechter, where basically the chorus and the choir is telling the Germans that their fate is doomed because they're evil, and the good will inherit the earth in effect. The other important musical activities really take place in the concentration camps and in the ghettos. There is an orchestra in the Kovno ghetto, which I'll mention in a little bit. There are orchestras in Auschwitz, both a male orchestra and a female orchestra. They perform, in some cases, for the Jews who arrive on the transports to, in a sense, calm them down as they're arriving in the chaos, especially if they're arriving at night. There's the male orchestra who plays marches while the slave laborers leave the camp to go out to break rocks or whatever they're doing. And these two orchestras continue for the long period of time that Auschwitz is in existence. Obviously, some of the members end up in the gas chambers, but many of them survive. And so these orchestras in hell were really a way to survive hell. And many famous musicians survived that hell because they were members of either of these orchestras. So I just want to mention a few. I've mentioned Fania Fenelon, who is a member of the Women's Orchestra, who wrote a book called Playing for Time, a very appropriate title, which later turned into a movie. Another was Alma Rose, who was the daughter of Arnold Rose, who was a conductor of one of the great orchestras in Germany and in Austria. And Anita Lasker-Wolfish, who was a great cellist, who also played in the Women's Orchestra. On the men's side, there was a man called Louis Manette, who was able to play in the orchestra because he knew how to play violin. And he was warned by one of his inmates that if he could play music, even though it was a horrible thing to do, he should do his best to make it to the orchestra, which he did. And he survived as a result of his being a member of the men's orchestra. But his real claim to fame was that Louis Manette was a trumpet player, and in fact, a jazz trumpet player. He was known in his home country as the Louis Armstrong of his country. And Louis Manette eventually survives the war and becomes a citizen of Canada. So we have our own claim to fame to one of these members of the orchestra. The last point I want to make about this war period is that one of the things that was sung in a choral fashion at Auschwitz, particularly by the children's choir, was Beethoven's Ode to Joy. When I've previously given this talk, I haven't mentioned Ode to Joy, but I thought it was appropriate because this year is the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. And so Ode to Joy is sort of a strange thing to be singing and playing in a concentration camp, especially by children. One of the great Holocaust historians is a man by the name of Otto Dov Kulka, and he describes the Ode to Joy being played in Auschwitz in the following way. There was a message of hope. The conductor, who was gassed, knew or hoped that some children might survive, that some might be able to start rebuilding civilizations, and to do so, they needed the noblest things that European civilization has made: Beethoven, Schiller, and Dostoevsky. This, Kulka says, is one possibility, in a very fine one, in fact. But there is another, apparently far more likely. The transmission of music and literature, of all that is best and most noble in our civilization, might also, he says, be an act of extreme sarcasm, the outermost possible limit of self-amusement of a person in control of naive beings and implanting in them naive values, sublime and wonderful values, all the while knowing that there is no point or purpose and no meaning to those values. So it's a sort of a contradictory thing. I would suspect that the Nazis knew quite well what they were doing by having this, the Ode to Joy played. What's interesting is the Ode to Joy generally is a celebratory piece of music. Wikipedia, which everybody uses these days, refers to Ode to Joy and the way it has been performed and the times it's been performed by mentioning a number of important dates and events, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall is celebrated by Leonard Bernstein with the Ode to Joy in part. The Hong Kong Festival Orchestra performs it in the anniversary of another important event. It's played in Spain. It's played in a number of different celebratory occasions. What's interesting is the Wikipedia article does not refer to the performance of Ode to Joy in Auschwitz, hardly a celebratory occasion. All right, so we come to what happens at the end of the war. The Jews are slowly liberated, camp by camp. And for the first time in many years, there is a glimmer of hope, which they see when they are met either by the Soviet soldiers in the East or the British, Canadian, or American soldiers in the West. And so we'd like to move into the post-war period and how music, Jewish music, is celebrated in the post-war period. So there are obviously a number of famous songs that come out of the war period, some written before the war and some composed during the war. Some of these will be familiar to you. I think maybe most of them will be familiar to you. And I thought I'd just read the lyrics of a few of them, and then we'll move into the first musical celebration in one of the DP camps after the war in a moment. So you've all undoubtedly heard of the song Es Brennt, which was composed in respect of a pogrom in the 30s in the Ukraine. And it's basically a nostalgic song marking the pillaging and the burning of one's hometown, small shtetl. There's of course the other famous shtetl called Belts, the song My Shtetl Belts, which is also quite famous. The ones I want to read the lyrics to are the Partisan Song, which for for the many years I've attended Holocaust memorial celebrations in Toronto, is always sung. Unfortunately, of course, there are fewer and fewer survivors attending these occasions. So that's one. And the other one is Wohin soll ich gehen? And for those who can't understand Yiddish, it means, where shall I go? And it's really a lament. It's a lament recognizing that nobody wanted to take in the Jews before the war started. And of course, nobody was rushing to take in the Jews for the most part after the war ends. But let me just read some of the lyrics from those two songs. So here is Wohin soll ich gehen? Where shall I go? The Jews always hounded and plagued, not sure of his hour or his day. His life is in darkness enclosed. His strivings are thwarted, opposed. Deserted, no friends, only foe, no safe place, no safe place, no safe day to know. Tell me, where shall I go? Who can answer my plea? Tell me, where shall I go? Every door is barred to me. Though the world is large enough, there's no room for me, I know. What I see is not for me. Each road is closed. I am not free. Tell me, where shall I go? And then the lyrics, I'm just going to read you some of the lyrics from the partisan song, Zoch nicht gein den letzten Weg. That means, let's not say that this is the last road we're going on. Of course, from the point of view of partisans, that's an important idea. Never say that you are walking the final road, though leaden skies obscure the days. The hour we have been longing for will still come. Our steps will drum. We are here. So again, it's this defiant tone. From green palm land to distant land of snow, we arrive with our pain, with our sorrow, and where a spurt of our blood has fallen, there will sprout our strength and our courage. So again, it's really a defiant song that was sung by the partisans, that was created by the partisans. The final point I want to make before we switch into the post-war period is, obviously this is not specifically related to the Jews, but you will be aware of the German euthanasia program that started when Hitler came to power, where people whose life was unworthy of life were euthanized by German doctors. They were people who either suffered from some physical disability, some genetic disability. And so these people, they didn't want them to hand over their genetic traits to children, so they killed these people. So I just wanted to mention the impact that that might have had if that was being done today in our age. Just think of the musicians we would lose through that kind of program. And I thought I'd just look at some of the famous blind musicians that we are all familiar with. Stevie Wonder, Ray Charles, Jose Feliciano, Diane Shure, who's a jazz pianist, Andrea Bocelli, Jeff Healey, a rock star, Art Tatum, George Shearing, Marcus Roberts, who is a present-day fantastic jazz pianist. So these are people who all would have been killed had they lived in the Nazi era. Look at what the world would have lost. And so when you think about them, you should think about the 1.5 million children who were killed in the Holocaust, and how many of those children possibly could have been the Stevie Wonder or the Jeff Healey of their day. Just think of how much the world has lost by the murder of those 1.5 billion children. Okay, so now let's move into the post-war or post-Holocaust period. You see the star of Leonard Bernstein there. We're going to get to Leonard Bernstein in a moment. But the first thing I want to note is the first music that is broadcast from a liberated camp. The camp was Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the British. And one of the songs that they sing in the camp when they are liberated is a song called Hatikva. And so this is a recording of that moment 75 years ago. Okay, you will have noticed, if you were paying attention, that the lyrics of Hatikva then are not the same as the lyrics today. They've been modified. When the state was created, the lyrics were changed slightly, but the melody is obviously the same. And the idea behind the music, hope, obviously was very important in 1945 as all these people were being liberated in very dire circumstances, but they still had the idea to sing about hope and for hope. Another example of this impact of music on survivors is the story of a comedian, Deb Filler, who's originally from New Zealand but has lived in Toronto, who tells a great story of her father in a DP camp. And I'm going to have Sigal play a little video, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the story, which you can't hear from this little part of the video.
Welcome back to the shtick, where we're in the studio in a very spontaneous segment, a whole episode, in fact, if we can get it in there, with Deb Filler.
Howdy doody. That's not what you say in Jewish, but I know you know what I mean.
Wie geht's dir?
Wie geht's dir?
Ich gehe jetzt anders. Was machst du? Was machst du? The other thing I loved about your show was the ganze Yiddish shtick.
Yeah.
It was really fantastic.
It's an homage to Yiddish, and it's an homage to music. And it's really an homage to how music is a key to survival, because I'm thinking in many, many cases it brings people back to where they, I mean, I've sing to my little great niece. She loves it. It's just like wakes her up. And there's something about music, and the story that I tell in the show, one of them, I've been given the gift of many of my dad's stories, and I've remembered them. And one of them is that Dad was in displaced persons camp after Auschwitz, after the death march and everything. In 1948, Leonard Bernstein came to the displaced persons camp in Landsberg, which is in near Munich.
We know Landsberg.
Anyway, there was a very famous concert where he played Rhapsody in Blue, and the orchestra who supported him, you know, Bernstein had come to Munich and invited by the Munich Symphony, and they were full of anti-Semites. And he felt really uncomfortable. He asked, are there any Jewish musicians? Well, the ex-concentration camp orchestra had been set up, and that ex-concentration camp orchestra were who backed him. When Dad saw that that music was performed, written by Gershwin, a Jew, and the orchestra were all Jewish, all survivors from the camps. And
I'm
the
getting
composer,
shivers all over my body.
It is. It's a shivery kind. And Bernstein himself, he had a number. Your parents had numbers?
Of course, better.
You know,
of course.
They were reduced to numbers. They thought of themselves as numbers, and for sure that the Jews were all going to be annihilated. So this was the moment when Dad went, wait, there's a Jewish composer and a Jewish conductor and a Jewish orchestra. Maybe I'll have a life. Maybe I have a life.
Hope.
There's hope. And that
Okay, so Deb Fuller tells more of her dad's story because it includes a visit from Leonard Bernstein to New Zealand when she is a young girl. She's in her teens, and she hears that Leonard Bernstein is going to be performing on a Friday night in one of the halls in New Zealand where she lives. And she's so excited because she's heard the stories from her father of Leonard Bernstein coming to the camp at Landsberg and playing Rhapsody in Blue. And that's what gave him hope to go on. And so she sneaks into the rehearsal hall. And although the people in charge are trying to shoo her out, Bernstein sees her and calls her over to the stage and starts talking to her. And she tells him the story of her father having heard him perform Rhapsody in Blue in the camp at Landsberg. And he's really taken aback. And he says, "What does your father do?" And he says, "Well, he's a baker." And this is a Friday. He says, "Does he make challah?" He says, "Of course he makes challah. It's Friday. He's going to be making challah." He says, "Well, invite your dad to come to the concert, but I'd love to have some challah for Friday night." So she runs back to her dad's shop. She tells her dad, "You'll never guess who's here. Leonard Bernstein is here. I've heard your story. And he wants you to come to his concert tonight." And he says, "I can't come." He says, "What do you mean you can't come?" He says, "I have to make these challahs." So he can't come. He doesn't go, but he gives her a couple of challahs to take to Leonard Bernstein. She sneaks back into the rehearsal hall. He invites her to stay for the concert. And of course, she delivers a couple of challahs to Leonard Bernstein to help celebrate Friday night in the Landsberg DP camp, a camp where my parents also spent some time after the war. There's another famous concert that takes place in an abbey called the St. Ottilian Abbey. It's also composed of survivors of the Holocaust. The orchestra there, it's an abbey that's been turned into a rehabilitation hospital for survivors. The conductor there is a man by the name of Michael Hochmeyer, who conducted the orchestra in Kovno, in Kaunas. And so he puts on, and there are a number of performances put on at the St. Ottilian Abbey. And one of these performances, he is conducting the orchestra, and after they're finished playing, up comes to him his brother, his brother Robert, who left Lithuania before the war, able to make it to the United States. He joined the American Army. He was there and able to meet with his brother for the first time in many, many years. So you can imagine that happy reunion, all caused by this music being performed for concentration camp survivors at the St. Ottilian Abbey. So let's shift focus to North America. So about 1947, 1948, the gates to America and Canada are open. Refugees are able to come. And many of them, of course, choose to go to the United States. They let in thousands, hundreds of thousands. And many come to Canada as well. Some go to Australia. But what's important for a number of individuals is trying to ensure that the music of the lost European Jewry and the music of the time during the Holocaust when music was composed is saved. So we have a number of individuals who take on the responsibility themselves without any financial help to try to collect as much music as they can. So we have a professor from a university in Illinois, David Boder, who goes over to Europe, and he's going there mainly to interview survivors. He's a psychologist. But in each of the interviews, he asks people to sing some song that they learned from the old days or from the camp where they were staying, and he records these. And about 50 years later, the recordings are discovered, and he's obviously recorded a number of songs that might otherwise be lost. One of the famous individuals in the Vilna ghetto is a fellow by the name of Shmerke Kazarginski. And Shmerka is a poet, he's a musician, he's an all-round good guy. During his time in the ghetto in Vilna, he becomes a member of the Paper Brigade, which if you don't know anything about the Paper Brigade, you should either invite me to come and talk about it, or you should read a number of books about books that were looted by the Germans, many of them from the libraries in Vilna and from the library of Uivo, which was located in Vilna. But after the war, he too goes about collecting songs from the partisans, from people in the camps, and through his efforts, we are able to have access to that music today. Another individual who does the same thing is an American by the name of Ben Stonehill. He understands that Jews are arriving in Manhattan. Many of them are being put up in a hotel called the Hotel Marseille. And he decides to go to the Hotel Marseille and to record these survivors, these refugees coming over from the camps, and collects their songs as well. And he collects about 1,000 songs from all of these people who've come through the Hotel Marseille. One other person that I should mention, and there are others, there's a famous Italian musician by the name of Francesco Latour. Francesco is a classical music composer. He's not Jewish, although he ultimately converts to Judaism. And his object in his life today, and for many years, has been to collect the compositions of people like those in the Theresienstadt ghetto or camp, and in other camps. And he has collected approximately 5,000 compositions, some finished, some partly finished. And he's put together a 48 CD set called a KZ set. KZ stands for a concentration camp, in which many of these compositions are recorded. And without the efforts of people like Stonehill and Latour and David Boder, much of this music would have been lost to us. And if you think that's all ended, it hasn't, because in the last couple of years, what a number of musicians and academics have discovered is music produced and created by Soviet Jewish soldiers in the war. And a number of these songs have been put together in an album called Yiddish Glory. Yiddish Glory, 2 years ago, was nominated for a Grammy in the world music category. And it's the first album record to be nominated that was produced in Yiddish. So many years after all these Yiddish speakers arrived in North America, in the 2000s, we have this CD, Yiddish Glory, that's put together by a professor up at York University and a couple of musicians to record songs that the Soviet soldiers sang during the war. Some of them make fun of the Nazis, some are melancholy. There's a whole variety of different songs. We're gonna get a little taste of some of that when Sigal puts up the next video. Maybe not. Well, I'll keep going. Hopefully she'll be able to.
The first eyewitness testimonies by Jews of what was happening on the eve of the Holocaust. They're not beautiful songs crafted by the best songwriters of that era. They're songs written by ordinary people living their lives, experiencing the war, experiencing Hitler and Stalin and all of that, and somehow maintaining, continuing to live a life and writing in their own voices.
Okay, so let me conclude by talking about the contribution of Jewish musicians around the world from the time of the war and after the war. So just to mention a few Canadians who we have as a result of their being able to escape to England, later being put into internment camps, and then being shipped over to internment camps in Canada, we have the following individuals. Walter Hamburger, who was the general manager of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra for many years. Helmut Kuhlmann, who was an archivist at the National Library in Ottawa and who wrote the book, The Encyclopedia of Canadian Music. He also was interned and came to Canada and sent to one of the internment camps here. We have Carl Anserl, who I've mentioned, who emigrates to Canada. We have John Newmark, who was the accompanist for Maureen Forrester, who's also comes to Canada as a result of the internment period. So that's just Canada. There are contributions really worldwide of these Jewish musicians. So in Great Britain, we have Rudolf Bing, who is in England, I think when the war breaks out, decides to stay with good reason. And he later moves to the United States and becomes the general manager of the Metropolitan Opera in New York for 12 years, 1960 to 1972. He is one of the founders of the Glyndebourne Festival Opera in Great Britain, and also the Edinburgh International Festival, obviously in Edinburgh. And these are world-class music festivals. Anita Lasker-Wolfish, who was a member of the Women's Orchestra in Auschwitz, becomes a founding member of a group called the English Chamber Orchestra, which performed for about 30 years. She's an interesting woman who you can find YouTube videos of her. She vowed never to return to Germany. She eventually is invited to come by Angela Merkel, and she's a really interesting lady. She's still alive. And then we have the Amadeus Quartet, which again also played together for about 30 years. There were 4 members of the quartet, as you'd expect. 3 of them were survivors who met in the internment camps in Great Britain when they were sent to the camps after the English troops had to evacuate Dunkirk. The influence extends even to China. In China, we have a whole group of emigres in Shanghai. Many of the emigres included musicians. Musicians performed for their own Jewish community in cabaret, but one of them, a man by the name of Ferdinand Adler, was a music teacher, and he taught a group of Chinese orphan boys music, and they grew up to be musicians, and their children, and they themselves and their children became the founders and foundation of the Chinese Symphony Orchestra today. In the Philippines, we have a man by the name of Herbert Zimmer, who accepts an invitation to go to the Philippines to be the conductor of the Manila Symphony Orchestra. And of course, when war breaks out, he stays. He eventually makes it back to the United States, and he becomes the head of the Brooklyn Symphony Orchestra. He's a very well-known educator, and there's a documentary about his life. His name again is Herbert Zimmer. So these are contributions made by Jewish musicians who survived the Holocaust, but also the Holocaust has had a great influence on music itself. There are many pieces that have been composed as commemorations of the Holocaust by quite famous musicians and composers, and I'm just going to give you a few examples. There are many more than these. Michael Tippett composed something called The Child of Our Time, which is obviously devoted to the children lost during the Holocaust. Arnold Schoenberg wrote A Survivor from Auschwitz, speaks for itself. Dmitri Shostakovich, his 13th symphony is also known as the Babi Yar Symphony, It commemorates the murder of about 33,000 Jews at the ravine in Babi Yar. Charles Davidson composed I Never Saw a Butterfly, which is a famous piece. Oscar Morowitz, who comes to Canada, composes a piece. Ben Steinberg, who's a Torontonian, has composed a number of pieces. And we even have modern day composers, a Jewish composer, Howard Shore, who has won a number of Academy Awards himself. He has composed music for a couple of Holocaust movies. The movie Denial, which is the story of the lawsuit brought by David Irving against Penguin Press, and Deborah Lipstadt. He wrote the music for that movie. And he also more recently wrote the music for a movie called The Song of Names, which was out at the end of last year, which is also a Holocaust-related film. And there are a number of Holocaust musical films also that and documentaries that you might be interested in. The Pianist is the story of Władysław Szpilman and his survival in Warsaw during the war. Adrian Brody, who played Szpilman, won Academy Award as Best Actor for that role. And Spielman's name will come up again when we talk about Rescuers next week. And then there's The Lady in Number 6, which is the story of Alice Hertz-Sommer, who I've mentioned, who was also in Auschwitz. Playing for Time is the movie based on Fania Fanelon's book, Playing for Time. And more recently, we have a movie called Joe's Violin, which is the story of a violin, an expensive violin that belongs to a man named Joe, and he passes it on to a less wealthy young girl as her violin. And of course, if you've seen the exhibit of Violins of Hope, you'll see that many of these violins have a Jewish star carved into them. And the last movie I'd mention is They Played for Their Lives, which is the story of two musicians who basically used their talent as a method of survival. One played the accordion and the other played whistle. He whistled along with the accordion. So the fact that they could perform in that way helped them to save their lives. And of course, they continued to make music for the rest of their lives. The last musical piece I want to refer to is a more modern piece. It's a piece by a rock band called Rush, a Canadian rock band. Many of you will be familiar with them. And one of the leaders of that group is Geddy Lee, who went to Mackenzie Collegiate, my high school. His really major partner in crime is Neil Peart, who wrote a lot of lyrics for their songs. Geddy Lee's mother and father were Holocaust survivors, and he has talked about his relationship with his mother and how it impacted on him. But there's one song that clearly has echoes of her experience, and it's a song called Red Sector A. He writes the music, Neil Peart writes the lyrics, and here's just a few of them. All we can do is just survive. All we can do is just survive. Ragged lines of ragged gray, skeletons we shuffle away. Shouting guards, shooting guns will cut down the unlucky ones. So it's a song really about a march at the end of the war. And that's, as I said, a response by Geddy Lee to the experiences of his mother. There are other musicians who are the children of survivors that you may or may not be familiar with. Bill Graham spent his childhood in the ghetto in Shanghai. He is famous for being a music promoter in San Francisco. That's one. And there are others. Andrew Previn, as I already mentioned. Billy Joel, his parents were also from Europe. So all of these people have obviously had this experience inculcated in them, like many children of survivors, like myself. So I hope you've learned something about music and the Holocaust in the last hour or so. I'm happy to entertain questions. I hope I have the answers. And if I don't, I'll tell you.
trains.
Oh, yes, I forgot one piece. I wanted to mention one of the great pieces of modern music about the Holocaust is a piece called Different Trains by Steve Reich, who's I'm not a big fan of modern music, but this is an interesting piece because of how it came about. Steve Reich explains that when he was a young boy, his parents were divorced. One lived in the East Coast, one moved to the West Coast, and he spent times in the years 1939, 40, 41, traveling from one coast to the other, a trip that would take him 4 days either way. And he got to thinking about what was happening to other people during that period, and he realized, of course, that people were being transported to the camps by train during that period. And he decided to create a piece of music to sort of put together those two kinds of experiences. We're going to play a clip for you that's about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes long, which uses not only music of violins, but also you hear in the background people talking about their experience on traveling by the trains. It's another talk I've done. I've talked about the significance of the role of trains, just to have you think about something. The Reichsbahn, which became Deutsche Bahn after the war, was the vehicle which was used to transport most of the Jews to the camps. They were paid for their effort. They were paid indirectly by the Jews who were put on these transports. And they earned, during the period of the Holocaust, it's estimated $660 million for transporting Jews to their death or to slavery. So here's an excerpt from Steve Reich's Different Trains. Okay. I would say, other than the gates of Auschwitz and Arbeit macht frei, the most iconic image of the Holocaust is probably a cattle car. It can be found on about 50 different sites around the world of parts of the Holocaust Museum. So that's a really interesting piece, trying to convey what it was like to travel on one of these trains to the camps. My mother, for example, she traveled from her hometown to Auschwitz, 60 miles. It took 3 days. And obviously in the heat of summer, because she traveled in August, without water and without facilities. By the time they arrived in Auschwitz, a number of people had already died. Of her transport of 3,000 people, 2,500 did not survive the journey beyond the gas chambers, 500 survived. So the trains are really an important feature of the Holocaust. Okay. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Everybody now have the ability to unmute yourself. So if you have a question for Eric, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Did anybody try and collect instruments from, I know there was that documentary on Violins of Hope. Were there any other efforts to recover any of these other valuable instruments that may have been lost during the Holocaust?
Yeah, there are some that were recovered. I mean, obviously there were many Jews in France who were fairly well off. They had pianos. There were pianos in other countries as well. There's a famous woman by the name of, I can't remember her first name, Wondowski, who had one of Chopin's pianos, which was taken by the Nazis and which she fortunately was able to recover after the war. Another kind of thing that was taken was musical scores. It was either Vladimir Horowitz or Arthur Rubinstein, I can't remember, whose house was invaded in Paris, and his musical scores were all taken. Obviously, they were incredibly valuable. They would have his notations, and he was able to recover those as well. So there were all kinds of items taken. Obviously, some were never recovered. There are famous violins, like Stradivarius, that have not ever been recovered. But to the extent that the Germans actually looted these items and saved them, which they did, some of them were discovered by the famous monuments men, and to the extent that the owners survived or their heirs could be found, the items were returned.
Any other questions? No? Okie dokie.
If you want to email me questions, if you're shy, you can email them to Sigal and she can forward them to me.
With pleasure. Last piece of business is just to whet your appetite for the last in Eric's series of 3 lectures, Rescuers in the Holocaust, next Thursday, the 25th. I would just encourage you to visit the Bethika website and please register. It'll be the same experiences. This time you'll register, you'll get a confirmation email and then a reminder email with the Zoom coordinates the morning of the 25th, because we know you're very busy and you get a lot of emails and we end up at the bottom of your inbox. I would take this opportunity on behalf of the synagogue to really just thank Eric and Judy for all of their incredible work. Just so moving and so just incredible to listen to your wealth of information. There were a number of points along the way that I had to wipe tears out of my eyes, and I just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. It has been an absolute privilege. Thank you very much.
It was mine.
I don't know. It's very weird that he would do that. I think it is from him.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I wish you all a fantastic rest of the day. It looks from outside my window that the sun is shining. So enjoy, and we look forward to seeing you all next Thursday. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everybody. Lehitraot.